Building an Octangular Log House in a National Wilderness. Episode 2. Photographs, text, and podcast created by Jack Lamb. Copyright 2026 John S. Lamb. All rights reserved. Observations about the nature of consciousness. Chapter 4. Toiling with the drudgery of stonemasonry. Although I had never built a house, I knew my design was pragmatically practical because I based all aspects of its construction on sound research. And while my lack of experience did not impede my aptitude to implement my design, it did affect my capacity to predict accurately the realistic assessment of the timeframes I should expect to be erecting the building by hand. Consequently, notwithstanding my appreciation of a reputable methodology originating with a foundation amply able to support the intended structure, I overlooked the inherent complications of utilizing hand tools to prepare our selected building site to receive the concrete footers to bear the burden of the construction. Eager as we were to begin erecting the house, we had absolutely no awareness when we began clearing the spot we selected to build in the forest just above the bedrock-lined swimming hole. It would take 10 months to finish the foundation. First, the trees on the building site had to be removed, hypothetically not difficult, since the reason we decided to build our house on the site where we did was that no big trees would be affected. Still, it required time to fell all the minor trees, cut and stack the wood in cords, and haul off the residual treetop branches. Once the site had been cleared, we began digging the foundation by hand to a minimum depth of 2 feet on the downhill side, which required we dig to a depth of over 3 feet on the uphill side. Increasing the scope of our excavation, until I cut a spade into the forest loam, I did not appreciate the nuisance feeder roots could be, let alone the exhaustive exertion removing the larger roots and tree stumps required. So as the days of monotonous labor stretched into months, maintaining a semblance of consciousness proved just as laborious. Between nearly every spade of dirt I dug, Nancy had to step in and cut the roots with a sharp axe, so we made negligible progress from one day to the next. And when it came to removing the tree stumps, the only consistent method that worked was to dig around them to a depth of 3 feet before severing the large trunk roots with an axe and a chainsaw, before yanking out what remained with the Land Rover's bumper-mounted electric winch. Considering that the hole we needed to excavate would be 47 feet in diameter, corner to corner at the widest point of the octagon, we comprehended that months of hard labor lay ahead. But while those long days would prove backbreaking, our evenings were peaceful. For after a refreshing swim in the creek, we would leisurely prepare our supper on a 2-burner Coleman stove, before sitting around the campfire to discuss the work remaining. Nancy's perseverance during those initial months of work impressed me from one day to the next, as did her enduring fortitude throughout the duration of the project. For while my clear vision of the house we would create was photographically imprinted in my memory, she could see very little of it, because she had difficulty translating the 2-dimensional drawings in my blueprints into a full-color 3-dimensional representation in her mind's eye. And by unconditionally trusting my foresight while she toiled endlessly at tasks she could not comprehend, it made her determination and fortitude to trust in my detailed vision of the life we were building, awe-inspiringly impressive. From my perspective, each hour of every day was a literal crash course in learning to follow a path leading to the future intent manifest by the artifice of assimilation I impelled into our joint timeline. By ascertaining how to keep my awareness focused on the horizon of possibility, I was able to adopt a resolute quietude of inevitability wherein the pathway delineated by the means of my creativity, and our labors, would ultimately lead to the credible end I envisioned. Forcing ourselves to excavate that foundation for 10 interminable weeks was similar to what it takes to ascend to a mountain summit at or above 14,000 feet. On high-altitude climbs when the corporeal body mutinies at the shortness of breath and the weightiness of taxed muscles struggling to function on insufficient oxygen, the climber shortens his or her step to the span required to maintain progress. Even if it means moving only an inch or two with each stride, the climber advances. And so similarly, each shovelful of dirt brought us a bit closer to our goal. All things come to pass in time if we apply ourselves to the physical machinations our causative perspective on reality proclaims to be prerequisite. And just so, the day finally arrived when our foundation appeared excavated to our perceptivity at the time. Had my consciousness been more evolved, I might have removed the dirt with a suspension of disbelief, an expression coined by the poet Samuel Coleridge in his autobiography In Discourse. However, based on my focused intent to build a formidable reality persisting in time, I forced my awareness to be mindful of each shovelful of dirt we exhumed, one painstaking clump after another. We made the mistake of mixing cement by hand in a wheelbarrow that first day, and struggled with preventing the last batch poured from setting before the next batch was ready. Accordingly, I scrounged an ancient cement mixer and powered it with a lengthy fan belt running off the engine pulley on the lawn tractor we borrowed from the widow's ranch. And for the next 5 days, we mixed and poured cement into the earthen footer trenches we quarried into the foundation hole. In addition to the 8 16-foot-long perimeter walls, we also poured the footers and the 12 by 10-foot concrete pad to support the fireplace mass. Since I occupied all my time spreading and troweling each batch of poured cement prior to laying and tying the steel rebar for the following pours, it fell to Nancy to add the Portland cement mix and shovel the sand into the old mixer before adding water as it rotated. While producing cement in a mixer proved not overly strenuous, mixing at least 30 batches every day for 5 consecutive days should have tested her resolve. But not once did she ever complain, and seldom did she stop to rest. With the foundation concrete now poured and set, it would have been nice to take a break. However, I began collecting limestone field rock from the exposed ledges in the surrounding forest. Freestone had been an integral element in my building design. But once again, my inexperience encouraged me to assume it would be easy to haul the stone down from the hillside to the building site through the dense, steeply sloping forest. The size of stone I wanted to use weighed 150 to 300 pounds each, so they were impractical to carry alone on the slippery decomposed cedar needles blanketing the forest floor. Accordingly, I generally lifted one end of a stone and flipped it over repeatedly to roll it to the house site. Because Nancy was physically unable to lift the corners of most blocks, this work fell to me while she foraged the forest to locate suitable stone. After a week of bending over hundreds of times for every rock I rolled to the house site, I had amassed very little stone for my unending efforts. And in an attempt to be more efficient, I built a wooden sledge to pull behind me. I would have used the mare to pull the sledge, but Nancy feared the many spiky dead branches sticking out of the red cedars on the slope behind the house would injure her horse. Pulling a sledge filled with rocks through the forest was strenuous work, but time-wise it was more efficient. This procedure worked well for the next 7 weeks until I gathered all of the stones of manageable size from the hillside behind the foundation. There were still larger blocks of stone too heavy for me to pull on a sledge. And when friends Charlie and Marcy visited one weekend, he helped me haul several of the larger blocks down to the building site where we mortared them in place atop the cured concrete footer to begin building a foundation wall. But even with his assistance, the excessive weight of the oversized stones made setting them in place a time-consuming challenge. We finally devised a procedure to lower each rock safely onto the footer by binding it with a logging chain affixed to the winch cable, run through a pulley suspended from a mobile wooden scaffold. While without help, it frequently took up to half an hour to reset the scaffold to set a single stone. And since the cement tended to set too rapidly, it made more sense for Nancy to mix mortar in small batches in the wheelbarrow rather than using the cement mixer. Henceforth on most days, we split our time between laying and mortaring the foundation walls, and hunting more stone on the many cedar balds easily accessible via our 4-wheel drive vehicle. But while the heaviest labor was now behind us, there was unending work yet to be done before we could assemble the stacked yellow pine timbers to construct our walls. When the outside foundation walls were high enough above the ground, we began laying the lichen-blackened stones we collected to build the fireplace. While it is impossible to remember each of the thousands of stones we collected over this period of construction, I do recollect the day we chanced upon a long rock perfect for the fireplace lintel. For the umpteenth time we conscientiously searched the exposed limestone ledges on the cedar bald we had to cross to reach Singing Stones. The generally 7-inch thick ledges, blackened by the residue from the centuries of lichen marring its surfaces, had been a prolific source for the thickness of rock needed for the fireplace. And one day, after removing the brush and loose stones from the blackened ledge rock, we exposed a 5-foot-long limestone slab ranging 9 to 11 inches in width. Peculiarly, neither Nancy nor I felt exuberance when we finished the foundation work. Rather, we only felt relieved satisfaction at successfully persevering for the duration of this seemingly never-ending task. The ordeal was our trial by fire, our descent into hell before ascending into heaven. But even though the worst of it was now behind us, we knew with certitude there were miles to go before we would be finished, and could rest. In retrospect, I do believe with the experience I have gained since, we could do the same work in half the time. But this is what learning is all about. The very first time we undertake a demanding challenge, it is a given that it will require more time and effort than it otherwise might, had we been more experienced. But the false starts and mistakes we make attempting to accomplish a task for the first time are precisely how consciousness learns to adapt over time to unfamiliar situations. And thus, not only how we manage to survive, but how we enhance the existentiality of our lives. Chapter 5: Transforming Vision into an Objective Reality. While the winter was mild, we nevertheless lost 5 weeks' work to cold weather. Still, the downtime living back in our cottage on the widow's ranch gave me the opportunity to reevaluate and modify my initial designs. For example, my original plan placed a bathroom in the loft above the downstairs bathroom. But when I actually stood inside the perimeter of the foundation, it was clear we had neither the room nor the need for 2 bathrooms in a house this size. Besides, I needed an access door to the water tank set beside the chimney, so we could replace the hot water heater if needed. Water heaters typically work for the term of the warranty, but in my experience rarely last a year more. Redesign is essential whenever we attempt to change consciousness to perceive and perforce reflect a modified reality, because we can rarely presage precisely what the future will be. So we repeatedly and variably suspend our disbelief through the course of the project. While this is also true when we purchase a new house, our suspension of disbelief is eminently brief because it happens all at once. But manifesting a house within reality by building it consciously requires copious incremental adaptations of variable extent. While initial alterations to a design are few and temporally spaced, they are usually of major import. But as the project approaches completion, changes are less significant, albeit more frequent. With the walls finally going up, a surprising number of friends and acquaintances began showing up to help us erect our house. Notwithstanding my attention on several important tasks, I welcomed one and all before working them relentlessly from dawn until dusk. Only then did I allow them to rest and share in camaraderie with the food Nancy and the other women prepared, accompanied by the heady homemade ale I monthly brewed in the 20-gallon crock my grandfather used to ferment beer during Prohibition. As I look back now, I wonder why so many people were willing to devote their energies to manifesting the reality Nancy and I envisioned. Undoubtedly, they got something real in return, which added positivity to their lives. In a metaphysical sense, the act of creation often inevitably draws disparate people like moths to a flame, to share and contribute to a truly conscientious effort. When a fellow cave explorer from our university goat roast days appeared and asked me to lead him on a long-promised exploration of the more than 20 miles of underground passages in Beauty Cave, he became so enamored with the clarity of our lifestyle vision he entreated us to let him share in the wonderment of building a house entirely with hand tools. Reminiscent of a convert requesting to join a monastery, or an adherent asking for an apprenticeship, the fervor in his countenance induced Nancy and me to acquiesce to his appeal. Consequently, Steve came to Singing Stones where he lived in a teepee for the following 7 months, working by my side 6 days a week, from morning until night. At first, I lamented the hours consumed helping him cut trees for teepee poles, and the days spent removing the bark with draw knives. But the determination he exhibited while helping us work on our house was 50-fold more valuable than the time I expended working on his teepee. Since Nancy did not have the strength to lift the timbers once the walls were waist-high, nor could she carry stone up the scaffolding to lay the 26-foot-tall chimney, Steve provided assistance when we needed it most. Setting each log in place on the 8 walls of the octagon was not as simple as it sounds. After a careful measurement, each 6x6 had to be cut to length and then the 4 notches judiciously marked with an adjustable carpenter's protractor, one at each end atop each timber and another set of 2 notches cut on the underside. Had we built a rectangular log cabin, we could have sawed each notch cut to depth at each end and then used a chisel and a mallet to remove the wood block quickly. But as this was an octagon, the notch cuts had to be made at a 45-degree angle, making it impossible to remove the excess wood with a few blows of a mallet on a chisel. Because of the angle, the saw cuts to depth repeated diagonally once every inch across the width of the notch, and then the unwanted wood chiseled out one recalcitrant flake after another. The time required to chisel a single notch averaged 45 to 50 minutes, so the time spent on this outwardly innocuous task consumed 240 hours for the 288 notches specified in my blueprint. When the timber was fully notched, we next lifted it into place to verify it socketed into the notches cut into the last layer of logs laid in position, and pencil marked for a recut if the fit was not perfect. Then when the beam fit correctly, we had to flip it over to hammer in 2 rows of nails into its underside, which later would be wrapped with baling wire to anchor the mortar chinking we used to seal the gap between the logs. Prior to 100 years ago, mud chinked the logs in a cabin, but subsequently, a cement mortar mix proved a superior sealant to keep the outside air from seeping through the cracks. Finally, before the beam was set into position, we laid a strip of fiberglass insulation between the rows of nails tacked to the timber just beneath it. Then we drilled and tenoned the notch at each end to pinion the log in place. When the walls were complete, we laid the fireplace stone to a level, 6 inches less than that of the perimeter walls, on which we assembled a rectangular frame built with 6 by 6 inch timbers to act as a base for the cornering rafter trusses supporting the 4 pillar beams bracing the chimney and buttressing the roof's full weight. The 8 horizontal beams connecting each perimeter corner to the frame collaring the chimney like wheel spokes, offered lateral support to prevent the roof's weight from pushing outward against the angled joints of the octagonal walls. I designed the cathedral ceiling to be comprised of 8 isosceles triangles with bases attached to the 8 perimeter walls, sloping inward and upwards to join at the chimney collar, thereby conically sheathing the entire roof. Each triangular panel needed to be transected with 4 by 4 yellow pine beams, affording the framing to nail in roof decking. The pattern bisected the triangle, framing the area in a diamond shape at the top end, and quartered the lower dissection with 3 equal-spaced 4 by 4 timbers of uneven length affixed betwixt parallel horizontal braces. 2 of the opposing 8 sides of the octagon would be gabled to open the roof like an A-frame, one in the living room perpendicular to the hearth elevated to a ridgepole 22 feet above the floor, and the other behind the fireplace to afford headroom for a second bedroom in the loft. The gable end high above the living room would contain the octagonal stained glass window I had designed and subsequently crafted. Erecting the roof corner trusses in place proved to be a complexity in logistics, as the 24-foot-long beams were too unmanageable for Steve and I to position alone. Consequently, Nancy and I opted to throw an old-fashioned rafter-raising party to augment our workforce by offering the incentive of a feast of beans and onions, cornmeal spoonbread and homebrewed ale to be served around the fire pit at day's end. Steve and I stayed busy prior to the rafter raising by pre-cutting and notching both the ridge poles and diagonal corner beams so everything would be ready for assembly. This was not an easy task. For while the cuts were alike where they fastened at the corners, every angle notch was different at the end where they affixed to the rectangular pillared support collaring the upper part of the chimney. Because everyone worked together and followed my directions to the letter, the rafter raising functioned better than I anticipated. Initially, we lifted the gable end A's into place before roping them into a vertical position. Next, we lifted and socketed the 2 ridge poles between each gable end A and the chimney collar before tenoning them into place. It required the remainder of the day to raise and fasten the 8 roof diagonals into the correct sockets. Had not I miscut 2 collar notches, we would have finished quickly. But alas, as it was, we had to remeasure, recut and renotch new beams to fit the unalterable collar notches. One day of help from 6 friends was all Steve and I needed to finish the roof. For we had no trouble setting in and nailing the 4 by 4 roof deck supports by ourselves over the next week. I want to underscore the importance of the assistance Nancy and I received while constructing our house. We would not have completed our effort as fast as we did, if 18 months can be deemed fast, had it not been for the help we received during our seemingly unending labor to hand-build our new home. Frequently working dozens of floors above the earth, Steve's familiarity with heights as a metalworker made him fearless at altitudes where most people would hang on for dear life. I nearly climbed the stairway to heaven 2 years past, but I never claimed to be oblivious to the giddiness of heights. Steve, however, had no awareness of vertigo, no matter how high above the ground he worked. Pacing the rafters as if he walked on flat terrain, on sunny days he would nap on the narrow 6 by 6 inch ridgepole after lunch, oft-time drawing the curiosity of neighbor children who walked miles through the forest to watch him sleep. Because I have a tendency to wander towards being a hermit, I know too well how a man can become an island unto himself. But I also realize truly great efforts require throngs of people to manifest a lasting change in reality, as evidenced by the pyramids of Egypt and Mesoamerica. Still, in my opinion, I generally find it more efficient to do a task myself, than assume others will finish it to my specifications. And throughout my life, whenever one of my many creations metamorphed into more than I could handle, compelling me to bring in assistance, I found myself managing rather than working, exchanging the perpetual joy of doing for the joyless fulfillment of managing what had to be done. Once we decked the rafters with pine planking and sheathed the roof with 4 by 8 foot sheets of an inch thick dough insulation, followed by a double layer of heavy tar paper topped with asphalt shingles, Steve rolled up his canvas teepee and bid us a reluctant goodbye. Propping his teepee poles against a high fork in a tree above the garden, each time Nancy and I walked to the chicken house or the milking shed, they reminded us of the time we 3 shared together. With the roof completed, Nancy and I installed all the doors and windows, nailed down the plywood subfloor, and last of all methodically and meticulously chinked the insulated gap between the logs, both outside and inside. Whereas there was still a great deal yet to be done, we moved into our new home just as winter fell, and summarily made it our own. Perhaps the only absolute truth I have learned in my life is the awe and wonderment of creatively embarking on a plausibly unattainable undertaking, to experience the ever-evolving ecstasy of learning what I must discern to bring it to fruition. Creativity is definitely more inspiring when it transpires over a seeming interminability of temporality, instead of swiftly manifesting over a short-term duration culminating in a hasty success. That said, I never felt regret when we completed our octagonal home at Singing Stones, because it essentially was the requisite first step on the life path we followed towards the self-sufficient lifestyle Nancy and I would ultimately build, not to mention the sequestered space I required to resume my explorations in alternate realities. Look for the next YouTube podcast episode of Building an Octangular Log House in a National Wilderness. Episode 3.